The train wheels screamed against frozen tracks as the boxcar lurched to a stop. Inside, huddled against the bitter cold of a Wyoming winter, 32 Japanese prisoners sat in silence. Most were too weak to stand. Their bodies, ravaged by months of jungle warfare and the brutal voyage across the Pacific, trembled not just from the cold, but from certainty. They were certain they would die today. Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his face against a gap in the wooden slats, watching his breath turn to ice crystals in the air. Through the narrow opening, he saw something that made no sense. Snow. Endless fields of white stretching to mountains so vast they seemed to touch the sky itself. No jungle, no ocean, no bombs, just silence and snow, and a landscape so alien it might as well have been the moon. The door slid open with a metallic shriek. Light flooded in, blinding after hours of darkness. Yamamoto's hand instinctively moved to shield his eyes, but there was no strength left in his arm. He had weighed 140 pounds when he left Osaka 2 years earlier. Now he weighed perhaps 90. His uniform, once crisp and proud, hung on his frame like a burial shroud. A voice called out in English, then in broken Japanese. "Come. Slow, no hurt." The accent was strange, the words clumsy. But it was the tone that froze every man in that boxcar. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't cruel. It was almost gentle. That couldn't be right. Nothing about this could be right. They had been told what awaited captured soldiers. Their officers had made it clear during training on Okinawa, again in the Philippines, and once more as they dug foxholes on Saipan. Americans, they were taught, were barbaric demons who tortured prisoners for sport. Captured soldiers would be mutilated, their bodies desecrated, their honor obliterated. Death in battle was not just preferable, it was the only acceptable outcome. Surrender meant betraying the emperor, the nation, and every ancestor who had come before. Yamamoto had believed these teachings without question. He had seen the propaganda posters plastered across every military base. Americans drawn as grotesque monsters with exaggerated features, their hands dripping with blood, their mouths twisted in savage grins. The radio broadcasts had been even worse, describing in vivid detail the fates that awaited any soldier weak enough to be captured alive. And yet here he sat, alive. Captured after his unit was overrun on Guam, he had tried to die honorably, had charged American positions with nothing but a bayonet, screaming for the emperor. But a rifle butt to the head had ended that charge, and he had woken up 3 days later on a hospital ship with his wounds bandaged and an IV dripping clear fluid into his arm. That moment had been the first crack in everything he believed. The Americans had saved him. Now, stepping down from the boxcar onto frozen ground, Yamamoto saw the second impossible thing. The men waiting for them were not soldiers in combat gear. They were cowboys. Real American cowboys, like the ones he had seen in the forbidden Western films that sometimes circulated secretly among young soldiers before the war. Wide-brimmed hats dusted with snow, heavy coats made of sheepskin and leather, boots worn from years of work. They carried rifles, yes, but loosely, casually, as if the weapons were farming tools rather than instruments of death. One cowboy, tall and weathered with a face like carved wood, stepped forward. He was old, perhaps 50, with gray stubble on his jaw and eyes that had seen hard winters. He looked at the line of Japanese prisoners with something Yamamoto had not expected to see in an enemy's face. Pity. "Lord have mercy," the cowboy said quietly to another guard. "They're just kids, skin and bones." Yamamoto understood no English, but he recognized the tone. It was the same tone his father had used when finding a wounded bird in their garden. Something in his chest tightened painfully. The prisoners were led across a clearing toward a cluster of wooden buildings, not barbed wire cages, not concrete bunkers, buildings with smoke rising from chimneys, windows glowing with warm light inside. In the distance, beyond more snow-covered fields, Yamamoto could see cattle, hundreds of them, their dark shapes moving slowly through the white landscape. A windmill turned lazily in the wind, its metal blades catching the weak winter sunlight. This was not a prison camp. This was a ranch. The Japanese soldiers shuffled forward in a ragged line, their wooden clogs and torn boots crunching through snow. Most had never seen snow before. Japan had winters, of course, but most of these men came from southern prefectures where snow was rare. To them, this endless white was as foreign as the red deserts of Mars. Some stumbled, their legs too weak to navigate the uneven terrain. The cowboys moved to help them, offering arms for support. The prisoners flinched away, expecting blows. But no blows came. Inside the largest building, the warmth hit like a physical wall. Yamamoto felt his frozen face begin to burn as circulation returned. The room was simple, functional. Long tables lined with benches, a massive cast-iron stove in the corner radiating heat, and along one wall, something that made every prisoner stop and stare. Food, real food, stacks of bread, pots of soup steaming on the stove, coffee in huge metal urns. An American officer, younger than the cowboys, perhaps 30, stood at the front of the room. He had an interpreter beside him, a Japanese-American man in U.S. Army uniform who looked uncomfortable with his role. The officer cleared his throat and began to speak. The interpreter translated haltingly. "You are prisoners of war of the United States Army. Under the Geneva Convention, you will be treated with dignity and respect. You will be given food, shelter, and medical care. You will be assigned work details appropriate to your health and abilities. Any attempt to escape will result in confinement, but you will not be harmed. Do you understand?" Silence. 32 men stared at the officer as if he were speaking in tongues. Geneva Convention? Dignity? It had to be a trick, a cruel joke before the real punishment began. Yamamoto glanced at the man beside him, Sergeant Hideaki Sato, older at 28, a veteran of campaigns in China and the Philippines. Sato's face was unreadable, but his hands were clenched into fists. The officer continued. "You will eat now. After that, you will be assigned barracks. Tomorrow, those healthy enough will begin light work duties. Questions?" No one spoke. No one moved. The concept of asking questions of an American officer was so foreign, it might as well have been suggested they sprout wings and fly. The cowboys began ladling soup into bowls, placing them on the tables with chunks of bread beside them. The smell was overwhelming. Beef, potatoes, onions, herbs Yamamoto couldn't identify. His stomach, which had been empty or filled with wormy rice for months, cramped painfully. Still, no one reached for the food. It had to be poisoned. Or perhaps this was a test of discipline. Eat and prove yourself weak. Refuse and die with honor intact. One of the cowboys, the tall gray-haired one, seemed to sense the problem. He walked to the nearest bowl, picked it up, and took a long drink of the soup. Then he tore off a piece of bread and ate it, chewing slowly, deliberately. He set the bowl down and gestured to the prisoners with a slight smile. "It's good," the interpreter translated. "You can eat." Another long silence. Then, somewhere in the back of the group, a young private, perhaps 18 years old, broke. His hand shot out and grabbed a bowl. He drank with desperate gulps, soup running down his chin. Others followed, slowly at first, then in a rush. Yamamoto was among them. The first spoonful of hot soup hit his throat and he nearly wept. It was the best thing he had ever tasted, not because it was particularly good soup, though it was, but because it was real, substantial, life-giving. Around him, men ate in silence, broken only by the sounds of spoons scraping bowls and ragged breathing. Some ate too fast and vomited, their stomachs unable to handle real food after months of deprivation. The cowboys moved among them with calm efficiency, taking bowls away from those who ate too quickly, offering water, speaking in low, soothing tones as if gentling frightened horses. Yamamoto ate slowly, forcing himself to take small bites. As the immediate desperation of hunger faded, his mind began to work again. He watched the Americans carefully. They moved without fear, without aggression. They treated the prisoners as if they were simply workers who had arrived for a job, not enemies who had tried to kill their countrymen. It made no sense. Sergeant Sato sat beside him, staring into his half-empty bowl. "This is wrong," he whispered in Japanese. "Warriors do not accept charity from enemies." "Warriors do not starve to death either," Yamamoto replied, just as quietly. "If they wanted to kill us, we would already be dead." "Perhaps death would be more honorable than this." Sato's voice was bitter. "We have already dishonored ourselves by living." It was a sentiment Yamamoto had heard many times in the weeks since capture, the shame of survival, the knowledge that back home in Japan, their families had probably already received notice that they had died gloriously in battle. To be a prisoner was to be dead in every way that mattered to the code of Bushido they had been raised to follow. And yet here they sat, eating American soup, breathing American air, their hearts still beating in their chests. After the meal, they were led to barracks, not cells, not cages, long wooden buildings with rows of bunks, each with a thin mattress, 2 wool blankets, and a pillow. There were windows, real glass windows, and a stove in the center of the room for heat. The cowboys demonstrated how to bank the fire for the night, then left them alone, closing but not locking the door. Yamamoto lay on his bunk that first night, staring at the wooden ceiling. Outside, the wind howled across the Wyoming plains, and snow pattered against the windows. Inside, 32 Japanese soldiers tried to process what had happened to them. Some prayed quietly to ancestors, others wept. A few argued in harsh whispers about whether they should attempt to kill themselves to restore honor. Yamamoto did none of these things. He simply lay there, his stomach full for the first time in 6 months, warm for the first time in 3 months, and alive when he should have been dead. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. Everything he had been taught, every belief he had held about the enemy, about honor, about the nature of war itself, was colliding with a reality that made no sense. The Americans were supposed to be demons, but demons did not serve soup. Demons did not offer blankets. Demons did not look at you with pity and something that might have been kindness. As he drifted toward an exhausted sleep, Yamamoto thought about the tall cowboy who had tasted the soup first to prove it was safe. That single gesture, so simple, so human, had done more to shatter his certainty than any propaganda could have built. If the enemy could show such consideration to men who had tried to kill them, what did that say about everything he had believed? He did not have answers. Not yet. But lying there in the darkness, listening to the breathing of his fellow prisoners and the howl of the American wind, Takeshi Yamamoto began to suspect that the war he had fought in the Pacific and the war he would experience here in Wyoming were 2 entirely different conflicts. One had been about survival and death. The other, he was beginning to realize, might be about something far more complicated. It might be about what came after. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Wyoming ranch, painting the snow-covered plains in shades of gold and pink. Yamamoto woke to the sound of a bell ringing outside the barracks, a simple metal triangle that clanged with insistent cheerfulness. Around him, the other prisoners stirred slowly, their bodies still weak, their minds still struggling to accept where they were. Breakfast arrived in the mess hall before the sun had fully risen. Eggs. Real eggs, fried in butter, 2 per man, thick slices of bacon that glistened with fat, toast with jam, coffee, black and strong, that burned going down but left a warmth that spread through the chest, and oatmeal, served in bowls so large that Yamamoto thought they must be serving containers, not individual portions. He ate mechanically, watching the cowboys and guards move through the room. They ate the same food from the same kitchen, sitting at tables not far from the prisoners. There was no separate meal for captors and captives. The realization struck him with quiet force. In the Imperial Japanese Army, officers ate differently than enlisted men. Rank determined everything, including the quality and quantity of food. Here, a corporal prisoner ate the same breakfast as an American staff sergeant. The implications of that simple fact were staggering. After breakfast, the camp commander, a captain named Wilson, with a weathered face and calm eyes, stood to address them through the interpreter. "Gentlemen," he began, and Yamamoto noticed that word. Gentlemen. Not prisoners, not enemy combatants. Gentlemen. Those of you cleared by the medical staff will begin work assignments today. You'll be working on the ranch, helping with cattle, fences, general maintenance. The work is hard but fair. You'll be paid 80 cents per day in canteen script. Paid. Yamamoto's English was minimal, but he knew that word. The interpreter confirmed it in Japanese, and a murmur ran through the assembled prisoners. They would be paid to work? Sergeant Sato's face darkened. "We are not laborers for hire," he muttered. "We are soldiers." "Soldiers who lost," another prisoner whispered back. "What choice do we have?" The choice, as it turned out, was simple: work or sit in the barracks. Given the alternative of endless hours contemplating their shame and uncertain futures, most chose work. Yamamoto was among them. They were divided into groups of 6 or 7 and assigned to different areas of the vast ranch. Yamamoto's group was placed under the supervision of a cowboy named Dutch, a man of perhaps 45, with a face like cracked leather and hands the size of dinner plates. Dutch spoke no Japanese. The prisoners spoke no English. And yet somehow, work began. Dutch led them to a corral where cattle waited, massive beasts that weighed easily 10 times what Yamamoto weighed. He demonstrated how to check the water troughs, how to distribute hay, how to watch for signs of sickness in the animals. His movements were economical, practiced, the result of decades doing the same tasks. He expected the prisoners to watch and learn they did. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on Yamamoto. 3 months ago, he had been firing a machine gun at American Marines on a beach in Guam. Now, he was learning to feed American cattle in Wyoming. The disconnect was so profound, it felt dreamlike. And yet the work was real. The cold was real. The cattle, with their massive brown eyes and steaming breath, were undeniably real. Dutch handed Yamamoto a pitchfork and pointed to a pile of hay. The gesture was clear: move the hay from the pile to the feeding trough. Yamamoto took the pitchfork, its wooden handle smooth from years of use, and began to work. His muscles, weakened by months of poor rations and disease, screamed in protest. But there was something almost meditative about the simple physical labor. Lift, carry, spread. Lift, carry, spread. No one was shooting at him. No one was dying. Just hay and cattle and the vast blue sky overhead. By midday, his hands were blistered and his back ached. But when Dutch handed him a canteen of water and gestured for him to drink, Yamamoto felt something he had not felt in years. Useful. Not as a soldier, not as a weapon to be expended, but as a worker contributing to something productive. The other prisoners in his group seemed to feel it too. Young Private Kenji Tanaka, barely 19, actually smiled when he successfully herded a stubborn calf back to its mother. It was a small smile, quickly suppressed, but it had been there. That smile was a crack in the armor of shame and despair they all wore. Lunch was brought to them in the field. Sandwiches, thick with meat and cheese wrapped in wax paper, apples, crisp and sweet, more coffee. They sat in the snow, eating in silence, while Dutch sat on a fence rail nearby, rolling a cigarette and watching the horizon. He offered the prisoners cigarettes, American cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, from a crumpled pack in his shirt pocket. Several accepted, lighting them with matches Dutch provided. Yamamoto did not smoke, but he watched as Sergeant Sato took a cigarette with a nod of thanks. The sergeant inhaled deeply, closed his eyes, and for a moment looked almost peaceful. Then the shame returned to his face, and he stubbed the cigarette out in the snow, half-smoked. Enjoying anything felt like a betrayal. As the days turned into weeks, the work continued. The prisoners learned to mend fences, stringing barbed wire between posts driven into frozen ground. They learned to operate simple machinery, hand-cranked devices that cut hay into manageable bales. They learned to recognize different cattle breeds, to identify which animals needed extra feed, to spot the signs of illness or injury that required a veterinarian's attention. Dutch taught them with patience and the occasional flash of dry humor. When Yamamoto accidentally let a gate swing open and 3 calves escaped into an adjacent field, Dutch did not yell. He simply shook his head, smiled slightly, and said something in English that made the other cowboys laugh. The interpreter later translated it, "Well, at least they didn't head for California." It was the first time Yamamoto had heard an American make a joke in his presence. The casualness of it, the assumption that a mistake was just a mistake and not a moral failing, was profoundly disorienting. The language barrier began to erode through necessity and repetition. The prisoners learned English words: cattle, fence, water, hay, fix, cold, eat, good. The cowboys learned a few Japanese words, mostly greetings and simple phrases. Communication became a strange hybrid of gesture, demonstration, and the handful of shared vocabulary that grew daily. One afternoon, Dutch was showing them how to repair a broken fence post. He pantomimed hammering, then handed Yamamoto the sledgehammer and pointed to the post. Yamamoto swung, missed, swung again, and connected with a satisfying thunk. Dutch gave him a thumbs up and said, "Good, good work." The interpreter was not even present. The meaning was clear in tone and gesture. That night, lying in his bunk, Yamamoto thought about those two words. Good work. Not adequate for a prisoner, not acceptable for an enemy. Just good work. In the Imperial Army, praise was rare and usually collective. Individual achievement was less important than group cohesion. Here, a simple job done well earned simple acknowledgement. The difference seemed small, but felt enormous. As October turned to November, the prisoners grew stronger. Regular meals, hard work, and adequate rest transformed them. Yamamoto could feel his body recovering, muscles returning, energy increasing. He had gained at least 15 pounds. His uniform, which had hung on him like a scarecrow's clothing, now fit almost properly. Others showed similar transformations. Private Tanaka, who had been skeletal upon arrival, now had color in his cheeks and could lift hay bales without trembling. The food continued to astonish them. Not just the quantity, though that alone was remarkable, but the variety. Beef appeared at nearly every dinner, potatoes in a dozen different preparations, fresh bread daily, vegetables, even in winter, somehow procured and served, and sweets, pies, and cakes and cookies that seemed impossibly luxurious for a nation at war. One evening, a prisoner named Yoshida worked up the courage to ask the interpreter a question that had been troubling all of them. How can America afford to feed us like this? Is the nation not at war? Should not food be rationed? The interpreter, a Japanese-American from California who had his own complicated feelings about the war, considered the question. America is very large, he finally said. The farms here produce more food than the people can eat. Even with rationing, even with feeding the military, there is enough, more than enough. The prisoners absorbed this in silence. Japan had been on strict rations since 1942. By 1944, civilians in Tokyo were eating sweet potato vines and acorns. Children were malnourished. The elderly were dying of hunger-related illnesses. And here, on an enemy ranch in Wyoming, prisoners of war were eating beef and pie. The mathematics of it were crushing. Yamamoto had learned basic economics in school. He understood production, resources, capacity. What he was seeing here was not just abundance, it was a different scale of civilization entirely. Japan had fought this war believing it could outlast American will, but will was irrelevant when facing this level of material superiority. You could not outlast a nation that could feed even its prisoners better than you could feed your own soldiers at the front. Sergeant Sato saw it too. One night, after a dinner of roast beef, mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, and apple pie, he sat on his bunk with his head in his hands. "We never had a chance," he whispered. "Did we? Not from the beginning." Yamamoto had no answer. The evidence was overwhelming. America's strength was not just in its weapons, though those were formidable. It was in its capacity to produce, to organize, to feed and equip and mobilize on a scale Japan had never approached. These cowboys, these ranch hands in the middle of nowhere, had machinery that did in hours what would take Japanese farmers days. They had trucks that moved cattle faster than trains. They had food storage systems that kept meat fresh through entire winters. The ranch itself was a lesson in American efficiency. Every task had a tool designed specifically for it. Every problem had a pragmatic solution. When a water pipe froze, Dutch did not call for engineers or wait for orders from superiors. He simply lit a fire, heated the pipe, and got the water flowing again. Problem identified, problem solved, move on. The simplicity of it was beautiful in its way. In mid-November, preparations for something called Thanksgiving began. The prisoners did not understand what this holiday meant, but they could see the Americans were taking it seriously. Extra supplies arrived at the ranch. Turkeys, enormous birds that seemed comically large, were delivered by the dozen. Sacks of potatoes, crates of vegetables, barrels of flour and sugar. The kitchen staff, two older women from the nearby town who came in to help with large meals, worked with increased intensity. Dutch tried to explain through gestures and the few English words the prisoners had learned. Big dinner, family. Thanks for good year. His hands mimed eating, and he smiled. "You too," he added, pointing at the prisoners. "You eat with us." The interpreter confirmed it later. On Thanksgiving Day, the prisoners would join the ranch hands and their families for a feast. They would eat together, Americans and Japanese, at the same tables. The announcement created confusion bordering on panic among the Adazi prisoners. Eat with American families, with women and children present? It was unthinkable. Sergeant Sato argued strenuously with the camp commander through the interpreter. "This is not appropriate. We are prisoners. We should not be included in family celebrations." Captain Wilson listened patiently, then replied in his calm drawl. "In America, Thanksgiving is about gratitude and sharing. We're grateful the war is turning, grateful for this land and what it provides. Seemed right to share that with you men. You've worked hard. You've earned a place at the table." Earned a place at the table. Yamamoto turned that phrase over in his mind. In Japan, one's place was determined by birth, rank, and social obligation. Here, apparently, it could be earned through work, through contribution. The concept was both foreign and strangely appealing. As Thanksgiving approached, the internal conflict among the prisoners intensified. They had been raised to believe that accepting kindness from an enemy was weakness, that survival without honor was worthless, that shame could only be erased through death. And yet, here they were, growing stronger, eating well, learning skills, and preparing to sit down to dinner with the families of men whose brothers and sons they had fought against. Private Tanaka voiced what many were thinking. "If we accept this, if we sit at their tables and eat their food and pretend to be grateful, what does that make us?" "Alive," Yamamoto answered quietly. "It makes us alive." "Is that enough?" Tanaka's eyes were haunted. "Back home, they think we're dead. Dead with honor. What would they think if they could see us now?" Yamamoto had no answer to that. The shame was real. The sense of having failed in their duty was real. But so was the warmth of the barracks at night, the fullness in their bellies, the strength returning to their limbs. So was the strange, uncomfortable realization that these Americans, these enemies, were treating them with a humanity that their own officers had often failed to show. On the evening before Thanksgiving, Dutch came to the barracks with an armload of clothes, clean shirts, denim pants, even a few jackets. "For tomorrow," the interpreter translated, "so you look presentable for dinner." The prisoners accepted the clothes in silence. That night, Yamamoto lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep. Tomorrow they would cross a threshold that could never be uncrossed. They would sit as guests, however uncomfortable, at an American table. They would share a meal meant to celebrate gratitude and abundance with people they had been trained to hate, and in doing so, they would take one more step away from the soldiers they had been and toward something else. Something they did not yet have a name for. Survivors, perhaps, or witnesses, or simply men who had learned that the world was far more complicated than the propaganda had promised, and that sometimes the hardest battles were not fought with weapons, but with the painful process of having everything you believed proven wrong. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a clarity that seemed almost cruel. The sky stretched endless and blue, the sun brilliant against snow that sparkled like broken glass. Yamamoto stood outside the barracks, breathing clouds of vapor into the frozen air, watching as trucks began arriving from town. Families climbed down from flatbeds and pickup trucks, mothers carrying covered dishes, fathers hefting children bundled in coats and scarves, grandparents moving slowly across the icy ground. Inside the barracks, the tension was suffocating. 32 men dressed in the clean American clothes they had been given, fumbling with unfamiliar buttons, adjusting collars that felt strange against their necks. Some had tried to press the creases from their pants using the heat from the stove. Others had combed their hair with water, attempting to look presentable, though for whom or why they could not fully articulate. Sergeant Sato sat on his bunk, fully dressed but unmoving. His face was ashen. "This is wrong," he said, for perhaps the 20th time that morning. "We should refuse, politely but firmly. We are not guests. We are prisoners." "And if we refuse?" Yamamoto asked quietly. "What then? We sit here alone while they celebrate? We insult their hospitality?" "Hospitality," Sato spat the word, "from enemies. Our ancestors would weep with shame." Private Tanaka, standing by the window, turned to face them. "Perhaps," he said softly, "or perhaps our ancestors never imagined a war like this, never imagined enemies like these." His voice carried a tremor. "I do not know what is right anymore, Sergeant. I only know I am tired of being certain." Before Sato could respond, the door opened. Captain Wilson entered, followed by the interpreter and Dutch. The captain's expression was kind, but firm. "Gentlemen, it's time. The families are waiting." They filed out in silence, a column of Japanese prisoners walking toward a destiny none of them could have imagined in their darkest or brightest dreams. The main ranch house had been transformed. Long tables stretched across what was usually a workspace, covered with white cloths that looked like they had been borrowed from half the households in the county. The tables formed a wide U shape, and at the center on the largest table sat 3 turkeys so enormous that Yamamoto at first thought they must be decorative. Surely no real birds grew that large, but they were real. Golden brown, glistening with butter and drippings, surrounded by dishes that seemed to cover every available inch of space. Mashed potatoes in bowls the size of wash basins, stuffing fragrant with herbs Yamamoto could not name. Gravy boats that looked like small ships, sweet potatoes topped with something that glittered. Later he would learn it was marshmallow, a concept so foreign it seemed like fiction. Green beans, corn, cranberry sauce that wobbled when the table shook. Rolls, dozens of them, steaming in baskets lined with cloth, and pies, so many pies, pumpkin, apple, pecan, cherry, arranged on a side table like edible sculptures. The American families were already gathering, perhaps 40 or 50 people in total. Children ran between the adults' legs, their laughter high and bright. Women in their best dresses adjusted silverware and straightened napkins. Men in clean shirts and slicked-back hair stood in clusters, talking in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the prisoners with expressions that ranged from curiosity to carefully controlled hostility. Dutch stepped forward and began directing people to seats. The prisoners were not segregated. Instead, they were interspersed among the American families, 2 or 3 prisoners at each section of the long tables. Yamamoto found himself seated between a cowboy named Jim, who he recognized from the fence-mending crew, and a woman who looked to be in her 60s, with white hair pinned up and a face that reminded him painfully of his own grandmother. Across from him sat a young girl, perhaps 7 years old, with blonde braids and enormous blue eyes. She stared at Yamamoto with unfiltered fascination. Her mother, seated beside her, put a gentle hand on the child's shoulder and whispered something that made the girl look down at her plate. But moments later, the eyes were back, studying Yamamoto as if he were an exotic creature from a faraway land, which, he supposed, he was. The noise in the room gradually subsided as Captain Wilson stood at the head of the main table. He raised his hands for quiet, and the families settled into their seats. Children were shushed, conversations trailed off. In the sudden silence, Yamamoto could hear his own heartbeat, loud and fast in his ears. "Friends, family, and guests," Captain Wilson began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "We gather today as we do every year to give thanks. This year, that tradition takes on special meaning. We're at war. Many of our sons and brothers are far from home, fighting in places most of us can't pronounce. Some have given the last full measure of devotion." A heavy silence followed those words. Yamamoto saw several women dab at their eyes with napkins. One older man, his face set in hard lines, stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Wilson continued. "We're joined today by men who, until recently, were our enemies on the battlefield. That's not an easy thing for any of us." He paused, letting the weight of that acknowledgement settle. "But one thing I've learned in my years is that war is what happens between nations. Peace is what happens between people. Today, we choose peace. Today, we break bread together, not as victors and vanquished, but as men who've all suffered from this war and hope to see its end." He bowed his head. "Let us pray." The room stilled further. Heads bowed. Yamamoto, uncertain of the protocol, lowered his eyes. "Heavenly Father," Wilson's voice was softer now. "We thank you for this bounty before us, for the land that provides it, for the hands that prepared it, for the community that shares it. We thank you for the men and women serving overseas, and we ask your protection over them. We thank you even for these men among us who were once our enemies, because their presence here reminds us that your grace extends beyond borders and battlefields. Help us to see in each other not what divides us, but what unites us, our shared humanity, our shared hope for a better world. Amen. Amen, the room echoed. Yamamoto had understood perhaps one word in 5, but the interpreter, seated at a nearby table, quietly translated the prayer. When he finished, Yamamoto sat in stunned silence. The American commander had thanked his God for the presence of Japanese prisoners, had asked for protection not just for American soldiers, but for shared humanity. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. Then the serving began, and thought became impossible. Dishes were passed with practiced efficiency, plates filled with portions that seemed obscene in their generosity. The elderly woman beside Yamamoto, whose name was Mrs. Henderson, he would later learn, personally served him turkey, sawing off thick slices and laying them on his plate. "You're too thin," she said, though he could not understand her words. The tone needed no translation. It was the voice of every grandmother in every culture, equal parts scolding and love. Jim, the cowboy on his other side, demonstrated how to pour gravy over the mashed potatoes. "Like this," he said, making a circular motion with the gravy boat. Yamamoto mimicked the gesture, and gravy flowed over his potatoes in a steaming, savory flood. Jim grinned and gave him a thumbs up. The little girl across the table finally worked up the courage to speak. "Are you really from Japan?" she asked, her voice high and clear. Her mother started to shush her, but Yamamoto understood the word Japan. He nodded. "Yes, Japan." The girl's eyes went even wider. "That's so far away. Did you come on a boat?" Yamamoto's English failed him, but her mother translated, and he nodded again. The girl seemed to consider this gravely. Then she said, "I've never been on a boat. I've never been anywhere but here." Something about her innocent wonder, her complete lack of fear or hatred, cracked something inside Yamamoto's chest. This child lived in a world where a man from the other side of the planet could sit at her family's table, and her primary emotion was curiosity. What kind of nation raised children like this? He began to eat, and with the first bite, all remaining resistance crumbled. The turkey was moist and flavorful, seasoned with herbs and butter. The stuffing was rich with sage and onions. The potatoes were smooth as cream. Each bite seemed to carry not just sustenance, but something else. Care, perhaps, or simply the accumulated skill of generations of cooks who had perfected these dishes. Around him, conversation slowly resumed. Cowboys talked about cattle prices and weather predictions. Women discussed recipes and shared gossip from town. Children squirmed in their seats and were gently corrected by parents. And interspersed among these normal domestic conversations were the Japanese prisoners, eating in near silence, overwhelmed by sensation and emotion. Yamamoto glanced down the table and saw Private Tanaka sitting next to a teenage boy, perhaps 15, wearing a high school letter jacket. The boy was explaining something, using his hands to gesture, and Tanaka was nodding, a slight smile on his face despite the language barrier. Further down, Sergeant Sato sat rigid and uncomfortable between two cowboys, but he was eating, his plate nearly clean. The little girl across from Yamamoto suddenly reached across the table, offering him a roll from the basket. "You have to try these," she said, again incomprehensible in words, but perfectly clear in intent. "My mama made them." Yamamoto took the roll with a small bow of his head, a gesture of thanks that transcended language. The girl beamed, clearly proud of her contribution. He bit into the roll. It was warm and buttery and slightly sweet, and had to close his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, Mrs. Henderson was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. Sadness, perhaps, or compassion. She reached over and patted his hand, her skin paper-thin and soft. She said something in English he did not understand, but the gesture said everything. As the meal continued, something shifted in the room. The initial awkwardness began to ease, lubricated by food and the strange intimacy that comes from sharing a meal. Jim asked Yamamoto, through a combination of gestures and the few words they shared, where he was from. Yamamoto managed to convey Osaka, and Jim nodded as if this meant something to him, though it almost certainly did not. Dutch, seated at the far end of the table, stood and raised his glass of water. "Like to say something," he announced, his weathered face serious. The room quieted. "Got a nephew in the Pacific. Marine. Haven't heard from him in 3 months. His voice caught slightly. "Don't know if I'll ever see him again. But I look at these men here today," he gestured toward the prisoners, "and I think about how somebody over there might be doing for him what we're doing here, treating him like a human being, letting him know he's not forgotten." He raised his glass higher. "To all the men far from home, on both sides, may they all make it back." "Here, here," several voices echoed. Glasses were raised throughout the room, water and coffee held aloft in a toast that included everyone. Yamamoto felt something hot behind his eyes. He blinked rapidly, trying to contain it, but failed. A single tear tracked down his cheek, then another. He was not alone. Down the table, he saw other prisoners with wet faces, their expressions stricken as they struggled with emotions that had no acceptable outlet in the world they had come from. Mrs. Henderson saw his tears and made a small sound of sympathy. She pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve and pressed it into his hand. "It's all right, dear," she said softly. "It's all right to feel." He did not understand her words, but he understood everything. And in that moment, sitting at an American table on Thanksgiving Day, 1944, Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto felt the foundation of his entire worldview crack and crumble. These people had every reason to hate him. Their sons, brothers, husbands were dying in a war his nation had started. And yet here they sat, serving him turkey, offering him handkerchiefs, including him in their prayers. The propaganda had called Americans weak, soft, corrupted by luxury and individualism. But this radical act of including one's enemies in the most intimate of family celebrations required a strength that Yamamoto was only beginning to comprehend. It was the strength of a people so secure in their values, so confident in their way of life, that they could afford to be generous even in the midst of war. Dessert came, great slices of pie topped with cream. Yamamoto chose pumpkin, though he had never seen a pumpkin before. The first bite was a revelation, sweet and spiced with flavors he could not name. Cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, the tastes of American autumn distilled into a single perfect slice. As plates were cleared and coffee was poured, the little girl across from him worked up the courage for one more question. "Will you go home after the war?" her mother translated, and Yamamoto nodded slowly. "Yes," he managed in English, "home." "I hope you do," the girl said solemnly. "I hope everyone gets to go home." The simplicity of that wish, spoken by a child too young to understand the complexities of war and honor and national duty, somehow contained more wisdom than all the military indoctrination Yamamoto had received. Everyone should get to go home. It was such a simple idea, such a human idea. As the afternoon wore on and the feast dissolved into conversation and children playing and adults sitting with full bellies, Yamamoto found himself thinking about what home would look like when he returned. If he returned. Japan was losing the war. He could see that now with brutal clarity. And when he went back, if he went back, he would carry this day with him, this impossible, beautiful, disorienting day when the enemy had welcomed him as a guest. He did not know if he could ever explain it to his family, to his friends, to anyone who had not lived it. How could he make them understand that the Americans were not demons, that they were farmers and ranchers and grandmothers and children, that they valued things like gratitude and abundance and the simple act of breaking bread together? That night, back in the barracks, the prisoners lay in their bunks, too full to move, too emotionally exhausted to speak. Finally, Sergeant Sato broke the silence. His voice was rough, as if his throat was tight. "I do not know what to think anymore." "Neither do I," Yamamoto admitted. "They treat us better than our own officers did," Private Tanaka said quietly. "Is that not strange? We tried to kill them. They feed us. Our own commanders sent us to die. They gave us Thanksgiving dinner." No one had an answer to that. There was no answer, only the fact of it, overwhelming and undeniable. They had been told their entire lives that the emperor was divine, that Japanese spirit could overcome any material disadvantage, that death was preferable to the shame of surrender. And yet here they lay, alive and full and clothed and warm, hosted by an enemy who had shown them more humanity in 2 months than they had known in years of service. The war would continue. Men would keep dying on both sides. But something had changed today, something fundamental and irreversible. 32 Japanese soldiers had sat at American tables and been treated not as monsters or demons or expendable tools of war, but as men, as human beings worthy of dignity and kindness. That gift, more than any weapon or strategy, would prove to be the thing they could not fight against. Because how do you hate someone who has shared their pumpkin pie? How do you maintain the certainty of your cause when the enemy treats you with the grace your own side denied you? Yamamoto pulled Mrs. Henderson's handkerchief from his pocket. He had forgotten to return it. The cloth was soft, embroidered with small flowers in one corner. He held it gently, as if it were something precious, which, in its way, it was. It was proof that even in the midst of war, kindness could survive, that even between enemies, connection was possible. Tomorrow they would return to work. The cattle would still need feeding, the fences would still need mending, the war would still rage across the Pacific, but nothing would ever be quite the same. Because on this Thanksgiving Day, 1944, on a ranch in Wyoming, they had learned the most dangerous lesson of all. The enemy was human, too. The weeks following Thanksgiving brought a subtle but unmistakable change to the camp. The prisoners worked with the same diligence, mended the same fences, fed the same cattle, but something in their bearing had shifted. They asked more questions, made more eye contact, occasionally even laughed at Dutch's terrible jokes before the interpreter had finished translating them. Yamamoto noticed it most in himself. He had begun to observe everything with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. The way decisions were made on the ranch, through discussion rather than decree. The way cowboys disagreed with each other openly, even arguing sometimes without anyone losing face or position. The casual equality between men of different ages and backgrounds, all valued for their skills rather than their birth or rank. In early December, the prisoners were given permission to write letters home, 1 page each in Japanese, subject to censorship. Yamamoto sat at the rough wooden table in the barracks for an hour, pen in hand, unable to begin. How could he explain any of this? The words he needed did not exist in the vocabulary of the world he had left behind. Finally he wrote, "Dear Mother and Father, I am alive and well in America. I work on a cattle ranch in a place called Wyoming. The land here is vast beyond imagination, and the winter is cold like I have never known. The Americans treat us according to international law. We have enough food and warm shelter. I am learning things about this country that surprise me. I hope you are safe and well. Your son, Takeshi." He read it over 3 times. It was truth, but truth stripped of all meaning. Enough food. What an absurd understatement. Warm shelter, as if that conveyed the miracle of waking each morning without fear. Treat us according to international law. How could that phrase communicate Dutch sharing his cigarettes, or Mrs. Henderson's handkerchief, or the little girl offering him a roll across the Thanksgiving table? Other prisoners struggled similarly. Private Tanaka wrote and rewrote his letter 5 times, finally producing something so bland it could have been a weather report. Sergeant Sato refused to write at all. "What would I say?" he asked bitterly. "That I have become comfortable in captivity? That I eat better as a prisoner than they do as free people? How is that anything but shame?" But the letters went out anyway, carried across the ocean to a Japan that was collapsing under the weight of war. Months later, a few responses trickled back, heavily censored, often barely legible. Yamamoto's mother wrote, "Your father died in the bombings last spring. Your sister is in the countryside with relatives. I am glad you are alive, though I do not understand where you are or why. Stay strong. Remember who you are." Remember who you are. Yamamoto read those words over and over. But who was he? A soldier who had surrendered, a prisoner who had accepted enemy kindness, a man who had sat at an American table and felt more human than he had in years of service to the emperor? The person he had been when he left Japan no longer existed. The person he was becoming had no name yet in his language. Winter deepened across Wyoming. Temperatures dropped to numbers the prisoners had never imagined possible, 20 below zero, 30 below with the wind chill. They learned to wrap scarves around their faces, leaving only their eyes exposed. They learned that metal touched with bare skin would freeze to flesh instantly. They learned to move snow, endless mountains of it, to keep paths clear to the barns and outbuildings. The work was brutal, but there was a strange satisfaction in mastering this hostile environment, and always, always, there was food. Hot soup at midday break, steaming coffee. That thawed frozen fingers, dinners that continued to astonish with their abundance. The prisoners had stopped being surprised by the quantities. They had accepted this as normal, which was perhaps the most profound change of all. In February of 1945, news began filtering through that the war was turning decisively against Japan. American forces had landed in the Philippines. Iwo Jima was under assault. The Imperial Navy was shattered. B-29 bombers were reducing Japanese cities to ash. The prisoners received this news in silence, their faces carefully blank, but in the barracks at night, the reality could not be avoided. "We are going to lose," Private Tanaka said one evening, his voice flat. "Completely. Utterly. Everything we were told was a lie." "We knew that the moment we arrived here," Yamamoto replied. "We just did not want to admit it." Sergeant Sato, who had been silent for days, finally spoke. "When we return home, if we return home, what will we tell them? How do we explain what we have seen? That America is not weak or decadent, that they have more food, more machines, more of everything than we ever imagined, that they won not just because of weapons, but because of how they organize their entire society?" "Perhaps we do not explain," Yamamoto said quietly. "Perhaps we simply show them, by how we rebuild, by what we choose to create from the ashes." Spring came late to Wyoming, but when it arrived, it transformed the landscape overnight. Snow melted into rushing streams. Grass emerged green and impossibly vibrant. Calves were born, wobbly-legged and curious. The prisoners worked longer days now, helping with the endless tasks of a ranch coming back to life after winter. In April, news reached the camp that President Roosevelt had died. The American staff and cowboys mourned openly, some with tears. The prisoners observed this with fascination. In Japan, the emperor was divine, untouchable, more symbol than man. But these Americans had loved their leader personally, argued with his policies publicly, and grieved his death genuinely. It was another piece of the puzzle that was democracy, messy and emotional and somehow functional. Then, in August, came the incomprehensible. Cities vaporized by single bombs. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, words that would echo through history. The Japanese government surrendered. The war was over. The prisoners received the news in a formation in the ranch yard. Captain Wilson read the announcement, his face grave. "The Empire of Japan has surrendered unconditionally. The war in the Pacific is over. You men will be repatriated as soon as transport can be arranged, likely within a few months." They should have felt joy, relief. Instead, there was only a hollow numbness. The war was over and they had survived it, but at what cost? Their homeland was destroyed. Their families, those still alive, were starving amid the ruins, and they themselves were now men without a clear identity. No longer enemy soldiers, not yet returning citizens, just survivors in a strange liminal space. Dutch found Yamamoto that evening, sitting alone by the corral, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. The cowboy sat down beside him, lit a cigarette, and offered one to Yamamoto, who had taken up the habit during the long Wyoming winter. They smoked in silence for a while. "You'll be going home soon," Dutch finally said. Yamamoto's English had improved enough to understand simple sentences. "Yes, home." The word felt strange in his mouth. "What will you do there?" Yamamoto considered the question. "I do not know. Build, maybe. My country is broken. Will need much building." Dutch nodded slowly. "Reckon that's good work. Important work." He paused. "You know, you boys taught us something too. Taught us that the enemy we'd been fighting, you were just men. Sons and brothers, like our boys. Makes a man think about war differently." Yamamoto turned to look at the cowboy. "You taught me more. You taught me that strength is not just weapons, is also," he struggled for the English word, "generosity, Kindness even to enemy? Humanity, Dutch supplied. That's the word you're looking for, humanity. Yes, humanity. Yamamoto tested the word. Japan forgot this, I think. Became only about honor and duty and sacrifice. Forgot humanity. Well, Dutch flicked his cigarette into the dirt, maybe you fellas can help them remember. Repatriation came in October. The prisoners were transported first to processing camps in California, then loaded onto ships bound for Japan. The journey took weeks, and with each day closer to home, the anxiety grew. What would they find? Who had survived? How would they be received? Men who had surrendered and lived. When Yamamoto finally stepped onto Japanese soil in November of 1945, the devastation was beyond anything he had imagined. The port city, Yokohama, was gone. Simply gone. Block after block of ash and rubble and skeletal remains of buildings. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin to the point of starvation, dressed in rags, their eyes hollow. He had gained 40 pounds during his captivity. He wore sturdy American clothes under his worn Japanese uniform. He carried in his pack canned food the Americans had given them for the journey, most of which he had not touched. And standing there, looking at his destroyed homeland, he felt a guilt so profound it threatened to crush him. But beneath the guilt was something else. Knowledge. He had seen how a prosperous nation functioned. He had seen what organization and efficiency and democratic principles could create. He had seen abundance, not as propaganda, not as theory, but as lived reality. And he understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that Japan would have to change everything if it wanted to rise from these ashes. The first years were brutal. Yamamoto found his mother alive, barely, living in a single room in the countryside. His father was dead. His sister had married and moved away. Their family home in Osaka no longer existed. He worked day labor, hauling rubble, planting rice, doing whatever paid enough to eat. Japan was an occupied country now, ruled by American General Douglas MacArthur, and the irony was not lost on Yamamoto. He had fought against America and lost. Now, America would reshape his country. But he watched the reshaping with eyes that had seen American ranches, American abundance, American democracy in action. When the occupation government began land reform, breaking up the great estates and distributing property to farmers, he recognized it as similar to the homesteading principles that had built the American West. When they introduced democratic elections, he remembered Dutch and Jim arguing good-naturedly about politics, disagreeing without violence. When they reformed education to emphasize critical thinking rather than rote obedience, he thought of the little girl at Thanksgiving, curious and unafraid. In 1949, Yamamoto was hired as a translator for an American agricultural mission teaching Japanese farmers modern techniques. His English, learned on a Wyoming ranch, made him valuable. But more valuable was his understanding of both worlds. He could explain American methods to Japanese farmers in ways that made sense culturally. He could help Americans understand Japanese resistance to certain changes. Years passed. Japan began its remarkable recovery. The rubble was cleared. Factories were rebuilt with modern equipment. The economy, guided by American investment and Japanese ingenuity, started to grow at rates that astonished the world. And throughout this transformation, former prisoners of war like Yamamoto played quiet but significant roles. They were men who had seen American abundance firsthand. They had learned American organizational methods, American attitudes toward work and innovation, American pragmatism. They became teachers, businessmen, government officials, always carrying with them the lessons learned in captivity. In 1956, Yamamoto received a letter with an American postmark. It was from Dutch, the cowboy from the Wyoming ranch. The letter was simple, written in the careful hand of someone not accustomed to writing much. Takeshi, been thinking about you boys. Wonder how you're doing. Heard Japan is doing better. Glad to hear it. If you ever want to come back to Wyoming, you'd be welcome. Always need good ranch hands. Your friend, Dutch. Yamamoto read the letter 3 times, then sat down and wrote a reply. He explained how Japan was rebuilding, how he was working to help modernize farming, how he thought often of those months in Wyoming and what they had taught him. He thanked Dutch for everything, though he knew no thanks could ever be adequate. The correspondence continued, irregular but warm, for the next 2 decades. Through Dutch's letters, Yamamoto learned that Mrs. Henderson had passed away peacefully in her sleep, that the little girl from Thanksgiving was now a teacher herself, that the ranch was still running, still raising cattle, still enduring through Wyoming winters. In 1973, Yamamoto finally returned to America, not as a prisoner, but as part of a Japanese agricultural delegation studying American farming methods. The trip included a visit to Wyoming. Dutch was older now, his hair completely white, his movements slower. But his handshake was still strong, and his smile still warm. They stood by the same corral where they had stood 28 years earlier, and Dutch said, "You know, I tell people about you boys sometimes, about that Thanksgiving, about how we were all scared and uncertain, but we broke bread together anyway. I think that mattered, maybe more than any of us knew at the time." Yamamoto nodded. "It changed my life, changed how I see the world. I tell my children about it, about the Americans who treated enemies with dignity." "That's good," Dutch said quietly. "That's how peace really happens, not in treaties or big speeches. In stories we tell about times when we chose to be decent to each other, even when we didn't have to be." By the 1980s, Japan had become an economic powerhouse, producing cars and electronics that competed with American products globally. The transformation from devastated ruin to economic miracle had taken just 4 decades. Economists studied it, politicians celebrated it, but few understood the subtle ways that American captivity had influenced that recovery. The former prisoners of war, now old men, rarely spoke publicly about their experiences. The shame of surrender was still too culturally embedded. But in private, with their children and grandchildren, they told stories about Wyoming winters and Thanksgiving dinners, about cowboys who treated them like men, about a nation so confident in its values that it could afford to be generous even to its enemies. These stories mattered. They created in the next generation a complicated relationship with America, part resentment for the war and occupation, part admiration for the principles and prosperity they had glimpsed through their fathers' eyes. That complexity, that nuanced understanding that former enemies could become partners, helped shape the strong alliance between Japan and America that defined the late 20th century. Yamamoto died in 1992 at the age of 70. His children found among his possessions a carefully preserved handkerchief with flowers embroidered in the corner, an old photograph of a Wyoming ranch, and a stack of letters tied with string. In his will, he left a small amount of money for a scholarship fund for Japanese students to study agriculture in America. "So they can learn," his will stated, "what I learned about abundance, efficiency, and the importance of treating even enemies with humanity." The mathematics of mercy are not taught in military academies. They do not appear in strategic planning documents. They cannot be quantified on spreadsheets or calculated by economists. Yet they are real and powerful and enduring. America did not win Japanese respect by bombing their cities, though the bombs forced surrender. America won Japanese respect by feeding its prisoners, by inviting them to Thanksgiving dinner, by treating them like human beings even when propaganda had painted them as monsters. That investment in dignity and humanity paid dividends that continue to this day. The descendants of those prisoners now work in Japanese companies that partner with American firms. They serve in government positions managing the alliance between the two nations. They teach in universities, explaining to new generations that former enemies can become the strongest of friends. And occasionally, when asked how that transformation happened, they tell a story about their grandfather or great-grandfather, about a Wyoming ranch in the winter of 1944, about cowboys who taught them to mend fences and herd cattle, about a Thanksgiving dinner when they sat at American tables and learned that the enemy was human too. The lesson is simple but profound. Weapons can force surrender. But only kindness can change hearts. Bombs can destroy cities, but only dignity and abundance and the willingness to share can build lasting peace. 32 Japanese prisoners expected rice and water. Cowboys served them Thanksgiving dinner with their families, and in that simple act of breaking bread together, They planted seeds of reconciliation that grew into forests of understanding. That is the mathematics of mercy. That is the power of treating enemies not as monsters to be destroyed, but as human beings who might one day become friends. The war ended with surrender, but peace began with pumpkin pie.